Hi everyone. So after watching my videos on factoring, it might be helpful to kind of get an idea of what steps you should take, so you know which approach to do when you see a given expression. So I'm going to do a short video on the steps that you should follow when factoring. Alright, so steps when factoring, we'll call this. And really, the first step, and I kind of mentioned it in all the other videos, was you want to determine the GCF, right? Greatest common factor. And I'll put in parentheses here, if there is one. And factor it out to the front. So our first step every single time is to look to see if there's a GCF. And if there is, then we factor it out to the front. If there isn't, then we don't. Remember, when I say GCF, a greatest common factor, I mean one other than one. The second step now really kind of leads you down a different chain depending on the answer to the question. The next question you should always ask yourself is, how many terms are there? Alright, so how many terms are there in your expression? This will really tell you what to do next. So we covered a variety of them, but if there's two terms, right? So if the answer to that question, how many terms, is if there's two terms, you want to say, possibly it could be the difference of perfect squares. Later on, when you go up to Math 104, you might talk about sum or difference of cubes, but in our class we only can look for to check if it is the difference of perfect squares. If it is, then you would factor it out according to the formula for that. If it isn't, then you can't factor it at all. That's the end of the factoring process. Alright, after that, if there weren't two terms, perhaps there were three terms. So if there's three terms, you have to ask yourself, is there a value, I'll say other than 1, in front of the first term? So if you're factoring, you factor out a GCF, count the number of terms that are left, there's three terms. You want to check to see, is there a value in front of the first term other than 1? If there is a value other than 1, right, so if the answer is yes, you want to use AC method, which, remember, is a way to rewrite to use factor by grouping, or you could do this by trial and error. Most students prefer AC method at this point, but trial and error would also work. If the answer is no, right, so if there isn't a value other than 1, so in other words, you look at that first term, you don't see a value there, so you know it's 1, then you want to use two sets of parentheses and reverse FOIL. In other words, right, you'd start with two parentheses like this, and then you sub in, if it was an x squared as a leading coefficient, x times x. You want to know what multiplies to the last term and adds to the middle coefficient. So if there's three terms, you ask yourself another question. If you see a value in front of the x squared other than 1, or if you don't. If you do see a value, you want to try to use AC method to rewrite it to use factor by grouping. or use trial and error. And if the answer is no, you don't see a value in front of the x squared, then 2 sets of parentheses right away. And then the last possibility is if after you factor out a GCF and you have 4 terms. When you have 4 terms, remember, that's factor by grouping. So essentially the number of terms tells you what to do. The way AC method works, right, when you had 3 terms is you're rewriting it so you're able to use 4 terms when factoring by grouping. So it's important that when you're approaching a factoring problem, just going back to the top, the first thing you do is look for a GCF. If there is a greatest common factor, you factor it to the front. If there isn't one other than 1, then you leave the expression alone. The second thing you want to do is ask yourself, how many terms do you see? Now, that means that if you took out a GCF, how many terms you see inside the parentheses. If there's 2 terms, you want to check to see if it's a difference of perfect squares. If it is, then you factor it using the formula for a difference of perfect squares. If it isn't, then you can't do anything else with it. If there's 3 terms, you want to ask yourself, do I see a value in front of my x squared term, my leading term? And if I do see a value other than 1, you want to try AC method or trial and error. All right? If you don't see a value, meaning if it just starts with some sort of variable squared, like x squared, then you can use 2 sets of parentheses right away and reverse FOIL based on what multiplies to the last term and adds to the middle. And then if you see 4 terms tells you should try factoring by grouping. So hopefully this gives you a systematic way to approach the problems that you're going to see. There is a worksheet that I provide in a general review of factoring that kind of combines all the different types of factoring in one place. Because so far you've only seen them in each video individually. Here you'll see them all together so you can practice. Hope this helps.